Welcome to the next part in my series of videos comparing Wizards of the Coast official content to some Kobold Press third-party content. Now, I got some feedback on my last video, and I completely agreed with it when I did a actual listen through. I have a problem of recording, doing minor edits, and then posting without actually listening, and I sounded like I hated what I was talking about. And part of that may have been because I did go into the last video hoping that the Kobold Monk would be better than the WotC Monk. Because, one, I'm a little biased to Kobold Press in general because I'm hoping third-party content is good, especially since I spent some money on it. It was very flavorful and very niche. The Ascendant Monk, compared to most of WotC's official monks, is better when it comes to just being a combatant monk, like what people feel like a monk should play as. So far you have Way of the Open Hand and Ascendant Monk, if you ask me, as the two best, like, combative monks. There is I believe it's the Way of the Shadow Monk or something that's a little bit more stealthy for that kind of play, but outside of that, most of the monk classes, subclasses have been lackluster, and the monk class as a whole is lackluster. So the last video, I wasn't really emotive, I wasn't really dynamic with my voice like I usually am, and I don't know what was up with that. It may have been because, like I said, I was a little depressed as I was doing the video, realizing, oh crap, this monk is not nowhere near as good as the WotC Monk. But I think today's video will be a little bit more, just a little bit more, because I had that feedback, I have a better understanding. So today, instead of comparing subclasses, we're going to be comparing races, lineages, heritage, whatever you call it in your game. I think there's still, like, back and forth in the community about which to actually go by. Personally, I don't care too much as long as the mechanics are functional. Ooh, hold on. Ugh. Okay. Had a little something on my arm. So today we'll be comparing the Warforged from Eberron's book to the Gearforged from Tome of Heroes. Now, I don't have the Eberron book, so I had to Google a good bit and look around for some more Warforged information. So I'm not going to have a lore conversation. In my previous video, I talked a little bit about the flavor of the two dragons. I think maybe I skipped that part. Maybe that's what didn't help either, because yeah. Anyways, I'm not going back to that video. I'm moving forward, going on this video, so I can't talk about lore too much. I just have a general creation concept. So let's move forward. Let's look at what we've got. Like I said, there's a Warforged versus Gearforged discussion and analysis, comparing the two. I put classes. It's supposed to say races. I'm getting better at this, guys, I promise. All right, so who do we got? Lore-wise, the Warforged, according to what I could find from the Eberron books, they're built from scratch. So basically, they're using organic and inorganic material combined together, and they're used as, like, soldiers, and eventually the AI became sentient. So I just imagine a bunch of gnome tinkerers were working on these things, and then one day they're just like, hey, Warforged number 87D5? Yeah, he said his name is Frank, and he has preferences. What do we do about that? So they kind of just develop sentience. I'm sure there's way more to it than that. But flavor-wise, they were created from scratch. The Gearforged, on the other hand, are pretty interesting because looking at, like, the Midgard lore in the Tome of Heroes text, the Gearforged are built specifically to house a soul that already exists. So souls can be captured in soul gems, kind of like Skyrim. But with those soul gems, you can place those soul gems in a Gearforged body that's built around the soul that's going to be using it. I don't know. The lore didn't really touch on, like, if you were a dwarf and they built a gnome Gearforged and you put the soul in there, which one do you use? And you'll see what I mean when I get to the actual sub races of the Gearforged, because it gets a little bit more complicated than the Warforged. So it's pretty interesting. In my home campaign, I have it's called the continent's called Drakar. It's a dragon-based campaign. I've ran a few. I say dragon-based campaign. It's a dragon-based world that I've ran a few campaigns out of. The Warforged there operate like in a in between. So they were built from scratch, like original by like a guild of artificers. But the first Warforged gained their sentience through like divine intervention. So like the first group of Warforged, basically a ancient gold dragon worm, used their power to breathe life into them. So they created like artificial souls. So my home campaign falls a little bit in between these, and I think there's a lot of flavor either way. There's no reason in your campaign, if you decide to allow Warforged or Gearforged, you can't swap the lore. You could use the Gearforged lore on a Warforged mechanic, because maybe when we get into it, you're like, I just don't want the Gearforged in my campaign because it's just so much. Or you don't like the Warforged because the Warforged does introduce some interesting concepts that I think might be campaign specific or setting specific. I don't know, because again, I don't know much about Eberron. But you could swap these lores or come to some cool in between. It's just this is what I could find for the original text. So let's move on. First thing we're going to look at, their commonalities. What do they have in common? So what do both races have? So Gearforged and Warforged are both resistant to poison. They both have advantage on saving throws against the poison condition, and they're both immune to disease. So that's their like chunk, like I'm a robot, this is my anatomy kind of thing. The second part, there is a slight difference in this, but what they have in common with their sleep is they don't actually sleep. They go into an inactive, like power down mode for 6 hours. Because remember, when you do a long rest, you only need to sleep for 6 hours, and then 2 hours of like light activity, like sitting by the fire, doing perception checks, not casting spells, not doing all this and all that, right? So you can, that's how they benefit from a long rest. They're never completely asleep. They're just inactive. They can still, both say they still see and hear normally. Or, well, at least the Warforged does. But let's get into it. So, what the Warforged has that is different from the Gearforged. So, we talked about what was similar. Now let's get into the differences. So, this is what the Warforged has. So, everything I just listed before, the Warforged has. On top of these traits. So, the Warforged, when you pick this race, you gain +2 Constitution, and then +1 to any other ability score of your choice. Now, both of these were released before Monsters of the Multiverse. I believe also before Tasha's Cauldron started messing with your ability to move around ability scores. Tome of Heroes is a supplement to the player handbook. So the reason we have these duplicate like Gearforged and Warforged is because Tome of Heroes is built considering the player's handbook. So the player's handbook core races and core sub-races can tie into Tome of Heroes. You can have just Tome of Heroes and the player handbook as a player in Manage. But once you start buying other books, I think the synergy moves away a little bit. So keep that in mind going forward with any of these videos. The ability to move the modifiers around is going to vary table by table. Because me personally, Tasha's, I use that book at my table, but I don't want to say don't allow, but I tell my players that if they want to change their subclass at level ups, which I believe Tasha's allows you to do, talk to me so we can make it thematic. If you want to change from Arcane Trickster to, oh god, what's the other one that's like really awesome rogue that has like Whales of the Grave. You'll mention it in the comments, and I'll feel dumb for not remembering, especially since one of them, Phantom, got it, boom. You don't get to drop it in the comments and make me look dumb, because I have a Phantom Rogue in my current campaign, so I don't know why I couldn't remember it. If you want to go from Arcane Trickster to Phantom Rogue, I will just flavor it. You know, I'll mention like you leaned heavier into necromancy and you didn't care about the other arcane magic, and then you learned this other shit. So that's really cool. But you need to figure that out at your table. So these videos are going to have the ability scores when they're applicable. So I'm not going to consider Tasha's. So you get +2 to your con, which is pretty good. Every class needs con. +1 to any other ability score of your choice, which allows you to pick whatever ability score directly influence your class. So wizards, you can pick intelligence, warlock, charisma, yada yada. You're immune to being put to sleep via magic. So in that you have that inactive rest, but you just can't sleep. You don't sleep, and you can't be put to sleep. So you're immune to magical sleep. So while in active status, it's supposed to say inactive. While inactive, it is unclear if perception checks have disadvantage, because with the Warforged, it specifically says you hear and see as normal, but you're inactive, so you can't look around. You're not in a, patrol. You're not doing guard because you're inactive. So the way I rule this is if you want to use your passive perception with a -5 to it, you can. And that'll be your passive perception throughout the night. So even on other people's watches, if they roll lower than your passive perception becomes the perception roll of that watch. So that's just how I rule that, even though the rules themselves aren't clear. You are considered a humanoid. You're not considered a construct. So certain spells that affect constructs or the such don't affect you. You are medium in size. You speak Common and one other language of your choice. You gain +1 to your armor class because you're a robot, so that kind of makes sense. Your armor integrates. Can't say that word. Your armor fuses with your body. It takes an hour, but you basically just force the armor into you and absorb it. And then when you want to take it off, it takes an hour. When you rest, if you rest in armor, you gain a point of exhaustion. I don't let that happen. I don't let that happen with Warforged, because it just doesn't make sense. So every day so your rest take 10 hours now, because you have to spend an hour taking your armor off before you can start your rest, and then an hour putting your armor back on before you can start a rest. Like, it's a little choppy. I don't understand it, how it's supposed to affect. Maybe the Warforged are immune to the exhausted condition. I didn't see that anywhere, but maybe I missed it. Or because they're not sleeping, they're in an inactive status, maybe that same effect doesn't apply to them. But either way, when you have this armor on in this way, it can't be removed against your will. I don't know when that comes into effect and how many campaigns that's actually a thing. It feels more thematic than functional. But that was the Warforged. So the Warforged had all of those, as well as what we listed previously about poison resistance, advantage on poison saving throws, disease, and they have an inactive status. We're going to take all those, and we're going to use those for the Gearforged as well, because those were commonalities. So the Gearforged also have those. Everything for the Warforged was a little different than the Gearforged. So this is what the Gearforged has that the Warforged doesn't. So the Warforged instead of +2 to con and +1 to another ability score, you get a +1 to any 2 ability scores of your choice. This clarifies that when you sleep, you get disadvantage on your perception checks, but you can still make a perception check. So I think that's a little better than what do you use your passive with a -5, or do you make an active check with disadvantage, which I guess mathematically comes out to a -5 anyways, but it's something to consider. Okay? If you can get some kind of shield or helmet or magical item like that grants you advantage on perception checks, this would just be a flat roll while you're sleeping. I wonder if this is how the Warforged is supposed to work, and Tome of Heroes just does a better job of clarifying it, or if they're meant to operate differently. The Warforged is considered, or Gearforged is considered both a creature and a construct, whereas the Warforged wasn't. So things that affect constructs, like the Shatter spell, also affect Gearforged. So that's something to keep in mind. There's 2 languages that the Gearforged knows default. That's Common and Machine Speech, which wasn't a language. I don't think it's an official language anyway, so it doesn't matter. But so you have those 2 languages, and then one other language that will be decided by your chassis. And we'll get to that in a second. Okay, it was immediately after. I apologize. It has race chassis. So that's going to be the rest of this video, because the Warforged is straightforward. The Warforged is the Warforged. There are no subclasses or subraces. There's no variants. The Warforged that I gave you, that's the Warforged. If you're going to use Gearforged in your campaign, there are 4 sub-races to Gearforged that you'll have to pick from. And we'll go over those sub-races in just a minute, but I'll give you a brief overview, because you have Dwarf, Gnome, Human, and Kobold. Now, when I hear that, I imagine anything else that was a humanoid falls under human besides Dwarf, Kobold, and Gnome. You could even say goblinoids will fall under Kobold. So that's just something to consider when you're coming up with a lore for it. But this is pretty interesting. You notice they don't have the immune to sleep that the Warforged have, and they don't have the +1 to AC. So those are 2 big losses depending on your campaign. Immune to sleep, that's so conditional. I see so many races that have immune to sleep that I just don't see magical sleep popping up as often as it could. I don't know, maybe that's just me. That's how I run campaigns. I just don't see magical sleep being a thing. So that's always a throwaway trait. So the biggest thing with the Gearforged versus Warforged is the +1 AC, and then they don't have to do weird things with their armor. But let's get into the chassis. We'll start with the Dwarf chassis. When you choose the Dwarf chassis, you get to add +1 to your Constitution score. So remember, Gearforged gets to add +1 to any ability scores of their choice. Now they also get to gain a +1 to Constitution score. They're considered medium-sized. They have a movement speed of 25 feet, 60 foot of dark vision, and they speak Dwarvish. All Dwarven features. So it seems very thematic. It seems like you're getting to be a Warforged and a Dwarf. You don't get some of the other Dwarven benefits, but it's very flavorful and makes sense. You get integrated one-handed weapon. So integrated one-handed weapon means any weapon with a one-handed property, you get to basically have it built into you. And I believe it allows you to basically quick draw and you can't be disarmed. So that's pretty good. Or cool. I don't want to say good. It's cool. It's flavorful. Mechanically, it's kind of interesting. I don't disarm my PCs a lot, so in my campaigns, I don't see how that comes up a lot. But it's something you have. It's a benefit. As a Dwarf chassis, you gain proficiency in 2 martial weapons of your choice, light armor and medium armor. So this would allow you to be a pretty decent caster or cleric of some kind, especially if you pick something with the one-handed property. Um, that's like a martial weapon that does, like, I don't know, does it need to be bludgeoning? I didn't look that up. Either way, you get to have like a pretty cool weapon in your hand. You get to wear light and medium armor. It's pretty cool. You also get advantage on sleight of hand checks to conceal that one-handed weapon that you have integrated. But that's all for the dwarf chassis. That's what you get. So you have your medium, dark vision, a weapon you can stow and hide pretty well, 2 martial weapon proficiencies, and light and medium armor proficiency. D&D has gone away from races giving you proficiencies, especially if you look Monsters of the Multiverse. I don't think any of those races give you any weapon or armor proficiencies anymore, and 1D&D is going away from weapon and armor proficiencies. So I don't know if Kobold Press will release updated content when 1D&D comes out to try and match that, or if they are just moving on after the whole OGL incident with their Black Flag project. It'll be interesting to see. But this was built before that, and this has weapon and armor proficiencies. So let's move on to, I believe next is the Gnome. So we're back at the Gnome. Yes, I love gnomes. They're so funny. Your gnome gets +1 to their intelligence. So you get +1 to any ability scores of your choice, +1 intelligence. You are small size. You have 25-foot movement speed, and you have 60 feet of dark vision. You speak Gnomish. Yes, you could have predicted those things because those are gnome features. You have a gnome chassis. You get to pick intelligence, wisdom, or charisma. You gain advantage on saving throws made with that ability score against magic. That's pretty useful, especially if one of those scores you don't have proficiency in and it's low. Based on your, like, if you're playing some combatant class, you want to put your wisdom up, or if you're, depending on your campaign, it's really flavorful and you get to make the choice. It is only against magic though, so I don't know how that would, like the dragon's intimidating presence, I don't know if you would consider that a magical effect or magic, or if that's just the dragon's like that scary. I'd have to look a little bit more into the rules before ruling on that. But the biggest thing as a gnome is, as a bonus action, you get temporary hit points equal to your proficiency bonus. And the reason that's big is temp HP is temp HP. Like, I'll take it. Anything that gives me a bigger pool of HP in a game where a combat can be pretty devastating if you're fighting, especially Kobold Press Tome of Beast monsters. But that's all we have for the gnome. We've covered the dwarf, the gnome. Next is the human. So let's look at the human. The human doubles down on that theme we've been seeing where it feels like a human. You get to add 1 to an ability score of your choice. So you get to +1 to any ability score of your choice, and then another +1 to any ability score of your choice. You get your medium size, 30 feet, get to choose an extra language of your choice. Elvish, Halfling, Sylvan, whatever is thematic. You gain proficiency in 2 skills or tools of your choice. And then choose one of those skills or tools or another skill or tool you already had proficiency with, and you now get double your proficiency on any ability check you make that uses the chosen skill or tool. So whatever proficiencies you already have, you gain 2 skill proficiencies or 2 skill choices or tool choices, or 1/1 of your choice. And then of that pool of the collective, pick anything you're proficient in that is skill or tool, and you get to double the proficiency in that. When you roll a 9 or lower on an ability check, use a reaction to change the roll to a 10. You can't use this to trait again until you finish a long rest. Depending on the skill that you rolled low on, this could be the difference between success and failure. Like, very clearly. This is actually pretty dope. I like it. Now that we're done with humans, we're coming to the last chassis. So we've covered the Dwarf, the Gnome, the human chassis, and now we're going to move over to the Kobold chassis. Kobold press, Kobold chassis. I have high expectations. Alright. Kobold gets +1 to dexterity. So you have +1 to any 2 ability scores of your choice, and then +1 dexterity. You are small, but you have 30 feet of movement speed. You have 60 feet of dark vision, and you speak Draconic. So far, the only chassis that hasn't given you dark vision is the human chassis. That alone is pretty important when comparing Gearforged and Warforged. Warforged doesn't get dark vision. Immune to magical sleep, +1 to AC, dark vision. Like, I'll let you decide which one you think is more impressive. You can take the help action as a bonus action. That kind of takes from the Hobgoblin concept. If you look in Monsters of the Multiverse, they have the Hobgoblin in there, and it does a lot with the help action. So I like that. That's pretty cool. The Kobold has this ability that I think is very interesting, but it sounds cool. It really depends on your campaign if this is going to function. If you have at least one tool set, you can cobble together one set of makeshift tools of a different type using that tool set for a minute. And you can't use the original tool set during that time. So I think the example they give in the book is if you have cook utensils, you can use those cook utensils as thief tools as long as the duration of your usage is less than a minute. So if you have to pick a lock and all you have are cook utensils, well, it's not going to take you a full minute to pick that lock, ideally. So you can use the cook utensils as thieves' tools. It says they're that tool set, so I wouldn't even say that would be like disadvantage, because it's like, oh, I'm going to use my chef's knife as a lockpick. Well, usually I would rule that as a disadvantage roll, but because of this Kobold ability, you just have a thieves' tool set. Yeah, it's a unique ability. I don't know how useful it's gonna be. Don't know how useful it's going to be. Huh. But that's the Kobold chassis. And that concludes my video comparing the Warforged to the Gearforged. Overall, I don't think there's a clear winner, because it's all going to depend on how you like to play and how your campaign runs. I do think there's a lot of mechanics in the Gearforged that can be ignored or switched over to the Warforged because they're just lore mechanics. So the Soul Stone or Soul Gem concept, the chassis being built specifically, you can still do that with a Warforged. It just doesn't have the same stats like the Gearforged does. So that's a pretty interesting thing to consider. I still think that the Gearforged is a lot more flavorful and brings a lot more variety to the concept than the Warforged does. The Warforged brings a +1 to the AC, which is always nice, especially with how bounding accuracy works in 5e. But the immunities of sleep, I don't see as a big leg up on the Gearforged, because honestly, I have hardly ever dealt with sleep effects in any campaign or even seen it be a big deal, except for maybe first level of the campaign, and then after that I just don't see DMs using it as often. Maybe because so many races have sleep immunity. I don't know. I personally leaning towards Gearforged. I'd love to hear what you think. So in the comments down below, tell me which one you like more, the Warforged or the Gearforged. If you were to allow one at your campaign, which would you be more likely to allow? If you have found this video educational, or if you just like having Tome of Hero content covered, please like this video. If you're feeling extremely generous, subscribe, hit that bell button. I'll be covering more Tome of Hero content in the following months. I'll try to get a more down-packed schedule, so get to posting a little bit more regularly and on a scheduled time. I cannot promise that because my work keeps me a little fluctuating and the 2 kids keep me always on my toes. So I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoy your weekend. Thank you. Have a nice day.